Chapter 2. The scene, if I may ask you to follow me, was now changed. The leaves were still falling, but in London now, not Oxbridge. And I must ask you to imagine a room, like many thousands, with a window looking across people's hats and vans and motor cars to other windows, and on the table inside the room a blank sheet of paper on which was written in large letters, "Women and Fiction," but no more. The inevitable sequel to lunching and dining at Oxbridge seemed, unfortunately, to be a visit to the British Museum. One must strain off what was personal and accidental in all those impressions and so reach the pure fluid, the essential oil of truth. For that visit to Oxbridge and the luncheon and the dinner had started a swarm of questions. Why did men drink wine and women water? Why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creations of works of art? 1,000 questions at once suggested themselves, but one needed answers, not questions, and an answer was only to be had by consulting the learned and the unprejudiced, who have removed themselves from the strife of tongue and the confusion of the body, and issued the result of their reasoning and research in books which are to be found in the British Museum. If the truth is not to be found on the shelves of the British Museum, where, I ask myself, picking up a notebook and a pencil, is truth? Thus provided, thus confident and inquiring, I set out in pursuit of truth. The day, though not actually wet, was dismal, and the streets in the neighborhood of the museum were full of open coal holes, down which sacks were showering. Four-wheeled cabs were drawing up and depositing on the pavement corded boxes containing, presumably, the entire wardrobe of some Swiss or Italian family, seeking fortune or refuge or some other desirable commodity which is to be found in the boarding-houses of Bloomsbury in the winter. The usual hoarse-voiced men paraded the streets with plants on barrows. Some shouted and others sang. London was like a workshop. London was like a machine. We were all being shot backwards and forwards on this plain foundation to make some pattern. The British Museum was another department of the factory. The swing door swung open, and there one stood under the vast dome, as if one were a thought in the huge bald forehead which is so splendidly encircled by a band of famous names. One went to the counter, one took a slip of paper, one opened a volume of the catalogue, and the 5 dots here indicate 5 separate minutes of stupefaction, wonder, and bewilderment. Have you any notion of how many books are written about women in the course of 1 year? Have you any notion how many are written by men? Are you aware that you are, perhaps, the most discussed animal in the universe? Here had I come with a notebook and a pencil proposing to spend a morning reading, supposing that at the end of the morning I should have transferred the truths to my notebook. But I should need to be a herd of elephants, I thought, and a wilderness of spiders, desperately referring to the animals that are reputed longest lived and most multiginously eyed to cope with all this. I should need claws of steel and beak of brass, even to penetrate the husk. How shall I ever find the grains of truth embedded in this mass of paper, I asked myself, and in despair began running my eye up and down the long list of titles. Even the names of the books gave me food for thought. Sex and its nature might well attract doctors and biologists, but what was surprising and difficult of explanation was the fact that sex, women, that is to say, also attracts agreeable essayists. Light-fingered novelists, young men who have taken the M.A. degree, men who have taken no degree, men who have no apparent qualification save the fact that they are not women. Some of these books were, on the face of it, frivolous and fastidious. Facetious. But many, on the other hand, were serious and prophetic, moral and hortatory. Merely to read the titles suggested innumerable schoolmasters, innumerable clergymen mounting their platforms and pulpits, and holding forth with a loquacity, which far exceeded the hour usually allotted to such discourse on the subject. It was a most strange phenomenon, and apparently, here I consulted the letter M, one confined to male sex. Women do not write books about men, a fact that I could not help welcoming with relief. For if I had first to read all that men have written about women, then all the women have written about men, the aloe that flowers once in 100 years would flower twice before I could set pen to paper. So, making a perfectly arbitrary choice of a dozen volumes or so, I sent my slips of paper to lie in the wire tray and waited in my stall, among other seekers, for the essential oil of truth. What could be the reason, then, of this curious disparity, I wondered? drawing cartwheels on the slips of paper provided by the British taxpayer for other purposes. Why are women, judging from this catalog, so much more interesting to men than men are to women? A very curious fact, it seemed, and my mind wandered to picture the lives of men who spend their time writing books about women. Whether they were old, young, married or unmarried, red-nosed or humpbacked, anyhow, it was flattering, vaguely, to feel oneself the object of such attention, provided that it was not entirely bestowed by the crippled and the infirm. So I pondered until all frivolous thoughts were ended by an avalanche of books sliding down on the desk in front of me. Now the trouble began. The student who has been trained in research at Oxford has no doubt some method of shepherding his questions past all distractions, till it runs into its answer as a sheep runs into its pen. The student by my side, for instance, who is copying assiduously from a scientific manual was, I felt sure, extracting pure nuggets of the essential ore every 10 minutes or so. His little grunts of satisfaction indicated so much. But if, unfortunately, one has had no training in a university, the question, far from being shepherded to its pen, flies like a frightened flock hither and thither, helter-skelter, pursued by a whole pack of hounds, professors, schoolmasters, sociologists, clergymen, novelists, essayists, journalists, men, who had no qualification save that they were not women, chased my simple and single question. Why are women poor? Until it became 50 questions, until the 50 questions leapt frantically into midstream and were carried away. Every page of my notebook was scribbled over with notes. To show the state of mind I was in, I will read you a few of them, explaining that the page was headed, quite simply, Women in Poverty, in block letters. But what followed was something like this. Condition in the Middle Ages of, habits in the Fiji Islands of, worshipped as goddesses by, weaker in a moral sense than, idealism of, greater consciousness of, South Sea Islanders, age of puberty among, attractiveness of, offered as sacrifice to, small-sized brain of, profounder subconscious of, less hair on the body of, mental, moral, and physical inferiority of, love of children of, greater length of life of, weaker muscles of, strength of affections of, vanity of, higher education of, Shakespeare's opinion of, Lord Birkenhead's opinion of, Dean Inge's opinion of, La Brière's opinion of, Dr. Johnson's opinion of, Mr. Oscar Browning's opinion of. Here I drew breath and added, indeed, in the margin, why does Samuel Butler say, wise men never say what they think of women? Wise men never say anything else, apparently. But, I continued, leaning back in my chair, looking at the vast dome in which I was a single, but by now somewhat harassed thought. What is so unfortunate is that wise men never think the same thing about women. Here is Pope. Most women have no character at all. And here is La Brière. Les femmes sont extrêmes, et sont meilleures ou pires que les hommes. A direct contradiction by keen observers who were contemporary. Are they capable of education or incapable? Napoleon thought them incapable. Dr. Johnson thought the opposite. Have they souls or have they not souls? Some savages say they have none. Others, on the contrary, maintain that women are half divine and worship them on that account. Some sages hold that they are shallower in the brain. Others say that they are deeper in consciousness. Goethe honored them. Mussolini despises them. Wherever one looked, men thought about women and thought differently. It was impossible to make a head or tail of it all, I decided, glancing with envy at the reader next door who was making the greatest abstracts headed often with an A or a B or a C, while my own notebook rioted with the wildest scribble of contradictory jottings. It was distressing, it was bewildering, it was humiliating. Truth had run through my fingers. Every drop had escaped. I could not possibly go home, I reflected, and add a serious contribution to the study of women in fiction that women have less hair on their bodies than men, or that the age of puberty among the South Sea Islanders is 9, or is it 90? Even the handwriting had become, in its distraction, indecipherable. It was disgraceful to have nothing more weighty or respectable to show after a whole morning's work. And if I could not grasp the truth about W, as for brevity's sake I had come to call her, in the past, why bother W in the future? It seemed pure waste of time to consult all those gentlemen who specialized in women and her effect on whatever it may be. Politics, children, wages, morality. Numerous and learned as they are, one might as well leave their books unopened. But while I pondered, I had unconsciously in my listlessness, in my desperation, been drawing a picture where I should, like my neighbor, have been writing a conclusion. I had been drawing a face, a figure. It was the face and the figure of Professor von X, engaged in writing his monumental work entitled The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. He was not in my picture a man attractive to women. He was heavily built. He had a great jowl. To balance that, he had very small eyes. He was very red in the face. His expression suggested that he was laboring under some emotion that made him jab his pen on the paper as if it were killing some noxious insect as he wrote. But even when he had killed it, that did not satisfy him. He must go on killing it, and even so, some cause for anger and irritation remained. Could it be his wife, I asked, looking at my picture. Was she in love with the cavalry officer? Was the cavalry officer slim and elegant and dressed in astration? Had he been laughed at to adopt the Freudian theory in his cradle a pretty girl? For even in his cradle, the professor, I thought, could not have been an attractive child. Whatever the reason, the professor was made to look very angry and very ugly in my sketch. As he wrote his great book upon the mental, moral, and physical inferiority of women, drawing pictures was an idle way of finishing an unprofitable morning's work. Yet it is in our idleness, in our dreams, that the submerged truth sometimes comes to the surface.